When João Felix signs for a club that he doesn't know where his place is, we know transfer window is still not over. Welcome to the Anglo-Italian podcast, and welcome back, more importantly, to this Premier League edition, where we'll be talking all of Game Week 1, as well as kind of alluding to what the main stories and topics across the Premier League have been. And I'm delighted to say that we are joined by a good friend, Del Telvik, who is going to help us digest all of those key stories. More importantly, Del, how are you doing this fine evening?
I'm good, mate. We're coming off the back of Game Week 1 where Man United managed to pick up 3 points, and it didn't, at some stages in that game, it didn't look like we was going to pick up one. So, yeah, good to kind of be back on the pod, but also good to have some positive things to talk about Man United. Not all positive, but we'll get into that later.
Well, yeah, this is a running joke, right? We always joke about the fact that we normally bring you on when it's really bad and terrible and doom and gloom, but actually we've got you on at the very good point where you've actually come off a good win, I suppose, and we'll kind of speculate about this Man United team and how they're going to progress. But more importantly, before we start and digest all of those key stories and talk about it, I'm going to go through Game Week 1 fixtures for those that are listening and watching right now. So we'll start off with the beloved Man United that kicks us off on Friday. Then they won 1-0 against Fulham. Then in Saturday's fixtures, we saw Ipswich losing at home to Liverpool 2-0. Arsenal beating Wolves 2-0. Then we had Everton losing at home to Brighton 3-0. Newcastle beating Southampton 1-0. Nottingham Forest drawing 1-1 against Bournemouth. And West Ham losing at home to Aston Villa 2-1. Then on Sunday, we saw Brentford beating Crystal Palace 2-1. Chelsea also at home losing 2-0 to Man City. And then on Monday night, we saw Leicester City grab a point against Spurs, courtesy of Jamie Vardy. And in that game, that ended up 1-1. But Sale, we'll move into our kind of first topic. And I think the key one that we've got to talk about is Chelsea and Enzo Maresca. And obviously, we laughed about it offline. There's what do we call this transfer policy strategy, or just combination of signatures? But what we both agreed is just the way that Chelsea have dealt with their players is horrific and horrible in terms of when you think about the longevity of a lot of these players who have come through the ranks. Just the way they've been dealt with is horrible. But the key here, I suppose, is when we're talking about the match itself against Man City. Man City made it look ordinary. It felt like nothing had changed under Enzo Maresca. And whilst they had at points higher XG, for example, in this particular match, it's ironic that you had your ex-midfielder in Kovacic just dominate the midfield against what was essentially a £200 million midfield in Enzo Fernandez, Caicedo, and Lavia, who I thought had a better match. I thought he looked quite good in the Chelsea shirt, but it did feel like the balance is still not there. I think it's summed up by Enzo Maresca's kind of quote at the moment in terms of how he's dealing with the situation when he said, I'm not working with 42 players. I'm working with 21 players. The others are training apart. I don't see them. They can even have 20-year contracts. It's not my point. I don't care. So even from that point of view, Del, it feels like he doesn't care for the strategy that is down there. He's just focusing on what he needs to achieve there. He's probably sick and tired of the same questions, to be honest, in those press conferences. But if we start off with kind of how Chelsea approached it in this particular match, are there any signs of improvement for you? And do you think that the players that they brought in are better qualities than what they had?
I think all of that goes out the window with the way that they've been kind of approaching the transfer market. I think when you sign as many players as they have and none of it seems to be sticking, I feel we're almost at a place now where you're looking at this Chelsea team and it's like, does Enzo know his best squad? Does any of the players even have any hope that they're going to be in a job the season after? Because it puts you in a position now where you're kind of looking at this Chelsea team, and I don't personally think I could tell you their best starting 11. And I think that's the really sad thing, because they've got some really talented players in that squad, and a lot of players who a couple of years ago would have been on the books, I'd say, some of Europe's top clubs, and it kind of seems like they're now being pushed into obscurity in the Chelsea under-23 team. And I know he's come out and like people have come out and said, "Oh, you know what? Like they'll be in the youth team, and it's just like, look, you don't sign players to sit in your under 23 squad. You sign them to develop into first team players, and they're not going to develop into first team players if they're sat warming your bench or in your under 23 squad. And I think their transfer policy really speaks for itself. And I think one of the things that we spoke about off camera was the treatment of Enzo Fernandez, and almost like in this hero-like role. And I think he was one of the players that I'd wanted to pinpoint from that game against Manchester City. And I think he was absolutely poor. I thought he was so poor in that game. And I think it really highlighted Chelsea's problems in midfield, and where they when Enzo plays in that 8 role, they don't really have a lot of creativity there. And anyone who wants to sit there and say to me, oh, Enzo Fernandez is such a creative midfield genius, and he's this and he's that, and that's like, I see him more as a deep line playmaker. He cannot play in that 8.
No.
I think that game really proved it for me. And I think the way in which they're playing on the pitch is really scary, but the way in which they're treating players off the pitch is just as scary, because the scariest part of that game was the attitude of Cole Palmer towards the end. It's like he was struggling to get involved. And it's for a player of his quality, your main focus should be to get a player of his level on the ball at all times. And there were times when Enzo Fernandez is higher up the pitch than Cole Palmer is.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And that's what they were working with. So I think, it's been bad from beginning to end for Chelsea, I think, all summer. And I think more news has come out today about the treatment of Raheem Sterling. And I know we obviously spoke about him off camera, and I don't like the treatment of Sterling, but I can kind of get in the sense of them wanting to move Sterling on, in the sense that his performances haven't been up to par. But the person I want to talk about is Travis Chalobah. Like, that is a guy who's been on your book since he was a kid. You want to treat a player like that, remove his shirt and have to give it to João Felix, like, disgusting treatment. And I think for me, that is why I think if I'm a prospect in world football right now, which I'm not at the age of 30 years old, I wouldn't want to go to the Chelsea project. I wouldn't want to go to Chelsea right now. No way.
No. And that's the thing that baffles me right now, is that when you see the treatment of players like Chalobah, like Conor Gallagher as well, for example, where they are players that have come through the ranks and being treated just to kind of establish the PSR kind of balance in terms of that aspect, it does feel like, well, isn't the message getting through that actually you're disposable to that club? You are nothing really in the grand scheme of things. And I don't know even if a Chelsea fan can actually feel like, they have a love or appreciation for the club anymore, because it feels like their heart's been ripped out of it. The very fabric of what maybe they adored about the actual club has been ripped out. It's no longer there. I feel it's really all about a money-making piece for the owners right now. And whilst I don't know about you, but I've seen so many what looks like paid-off journalists are now doing like certain scriptures and reports about how this is justifiable. They're looking at the long-term aims, by getting these players on 20-year contracts, then essentially they're balancing the books for the future. It is horrific, absolutely awful. Carval Sofahal, I think, is a guy who obviously reports for Sky Sports. He did a tweet recently, and it just looks so blatantly like he was paid off by the owners to kind of come out with this drivel. And I suppose if we try and stick to the football aspects, I mean, in terms of Enzo Maresca, I don't know if I necessarily saw an upgrade in terms of performance against Pochettino. No. And that's the worry. And I suppose if I pose this question, what do Chelsea do next? Does he stick to his principles and try and grind out his kind of preferred 25 or 26 man squad? And it does seem from that quote that I read out that that's what he's trying to do, is that he's trying to get around the noise and try and establish a team. But when you've got players like Jackson up front and he can't even do the basics, I mean, there was that goal what was ruled out for basically being offside. And I could see it, even though I'm not like a Premier League caliber striker. You only have to look across the line to see Manuel Kanji is there. So you got to just drive and make sure that you're in the onside position.
Across the line, he's next to him. He is next to him, mate. Like,
that's the problem.
And I think that is what we're looking at here. Is that we're looking at this Chelsea team and they look poor. Like, I think with Enzo, he kind of has to look at this Chelsea team and think, right, what are the areas are that needs to be highlighted that are the biggest areas of concern.
Mm.
Number one, I spoke about it a second ago, is why was Cole Palmer struggling to get the ball at his feet? Like, they're like, he is your most influential player, and he is almost playing the position of an inverted fullback at times in that Chelsea system the other day. You need to move Cole Palmer into the middle. I'm sorry. Push it like in a system like England's where the wide forwards see a lot of the ball, playing Cole Palmer on the right-hand side does work very well. Whereas in a game where it's going to be a lot more through the middle of the park, a lot more passing football, where let's be real, it's not a secret that Pep likes to play the ball around. So the middle of the park will have seen a lot of the football. If I'm Enzo Maresca, I take that as someone who's worked with Pep. I then take that and go, oh, okay, who do I want in the center of the park? My most influential player. And I think a decision that actually probably cost Chelsea, I think, was not taking Enzo Fernandez off. I mean, taking Lavia off, because like you alluded to earlier, Lavia didn't play badly. And I feel like that's something in which this next with Chelsea is, as much as Enzo Maresca's been brought in, they said he's going to have time. Is he going to be able to make those decisions? Because I feel like it's going to be those decisions that either keep him his job or are going to be the ones that end up losing his job in the long run.
Yeah, definitely. And I do genuinely think he's going to be one of the first few managers potentially to lose his job, because I think within time, if they don't get results, the pressure will kind of take its toll on Chelsea as a whole team, not just from a board level, but also from a team level as well. And I'm just genuinely curious to see how the kind of events unfold. One kind of positive, though, I would say, is although he was signed again this summer, was Pedro Neto when he did come on. And I appreciate he'll probably only play 13 games knowing his injury history. But if he can get a tune out of him, he did look to kind of restructure that kind of balance in that team. Do you think if they are able to get a tune out of Pedro Neto, as well as maybe get a balance kind of maybe winger on the other side, do you think the only gap then is potentially defensively as well as maybe up front as well?
There was a couple of good substitutions that Maresca made. And I feel like Pedro Neto was one of those. And I feel like he kind of showed that when he got the ball at his feet. You could tell he really wanted to make something happen. And for me, Pedro Neto is the very old school Chelsea style of winger. Pacey, direct, gets his head down, drives at defenders and gets the ball into the box. And I don't feel like they've had that sort of they've had that sort of winger, but to that sort of level for a very long time. I feel like Neto's almost come in to play the role in which they wanted Mudryk to play. And I feel like he is someone as well who should be looked at in this. And by signing Pedro Neto and a player of that caliber, is that goodbye to Mykhailo Mudryk? Is that now goodbye to game time for players like Yanoni Madueke's? But when Pedro Neto come on, he looked like he could make something happen. And I feel like that is the positives to take away from this game. Is you've spent a lot of money on a guy. He's now come in and in a short cameo has shown you what he can do.
Yeah,
that is a positive to take away. And I feel like we said, the shirt number stuff taken away from all of this. I feel like he could, if he stays fit, he could actually. I've always rated him extremely highly. So if he stays fit, I think he could be an absolute problem for them once they get kicking.
Let's do some quick observations on Man City then. They didn't really have to get out of third gear, to be honest, in this match. They seemed quite comfortable. And that's pretty annoying for the rest of the Premier League, I would say. But one of the observations I did make was Rico Lewis's kind of performance. And obviously his inclusion at the very beginning, I thought, oh, that's kind of bold from, Pep to kind of make him the right back. But when you look at this performance, that was absolutely incredible. And we spoke about it offline. If there's anything that we haven't seen of his game is whether he's got some scoring shoots and scoring boots, should I say, and if he can score a little bit more regularly. But I mean, he looks like he's displaced Kyle Walker already. And that was such a mature performance because he was driving, he was defending, he was getting those interceptions. He seems like a complete midfielder and defender, right?
Massively, mate. And I think Rico Lewis is that type of player where you kind of look at from a rival club and you think, oh, damn it. Like you would wish he was at your club. Like you can kind of see that position in the Man City team is now established for the next 10 years. But the scary thing about Rico Lewis is he can play 3 or 4 positions on the field. So it now puts us in a position where you look at Rico Lewis, and yes, he's an amazing right back, but I've seen him have some extremely good games in the center of midfield as well. So I think it's not just his talent, it's his versatility to that Manchester City team. And I think that's something in which Pep always looks for in players is, are you just that type of player who can play one position and run well? And he looks for players that can play a few. And I think Rico Lewis fits that bill. And I think the more game time he really starts to give him, we've seen it with Foden and the trophies that he's won over the past few days. You look at how someone like Rico Lewis can really benefit from a long run in the team. Kyle Walker didn't have a great Euros. I will say that. Kyle Walker he isn't the youngest player as well. So I feel like we're now at a time where Rico Lewis could really start to get some game time under his skin and really make that. I feel like that number 2 shot next. I think like Kyle Walker's gone next after that one game. I'm looking at it, I'm thinking Kyle Walker can go. That number 2 shot can go to Rico Lewis and everyone is happy.
Yeah, certainly. I think that is the transition season. This is the transitional kind of season. There's been a lot of rumours about Kyle Walker potentially maybe taking up an offer from Saudi, maybe seeing out his kind of latter days now of his career. But I still feel like Pep trusts him in terms of what he can kind of add to the team. And I suppose it's going to be the experience now and that kind of leadership that he can potentially bring and maybe even guide Rico Lewis in terms of what he does in certain scenarios. So, but I would say he seems to have like the maturity, the brain as well with Rico Lewis. He's not a person that seems to shy away from doing things. And, he's quite brave in that respect. What I think is really annoying, though, Tel, is this week, and it seems inevitable by the end of this week, that they'll confirm Ilkay Gundogan being signed by Man City on a 1-year contract from Barcelona, which who knew that was never going to work out right at Barcelona. But Ilkay Gundogan back at Manchester. We did speculate in our preview, Del, that we felt like maybe in the middle of the park when Rodri gets injured, there's going to be a gap. Does this kind of gap no longer exist because Gundogan is there?
There's that running sort of. There's a few. There's goats of sport in your Michael Jordans and your Pelés and your Maradonas and whoever it is. But in some instances in sports, there's specific time frames and periods where players have really, really gone on to shine. And I feel like we're about to approach one of those periods.
It's just,
So you look at Ilkay Gundogan and what happens is people doubt him. He then goes on to have an unbelievable run of games. I think it was the season. Was it 2-0? City were down on the final day of the season? Or 1-0 down. I can't. And he ends up just turning it on. I think they call it the final 10 games of the season, Gundogan. And he is unbelievable. And as a Man United fan, I know he can start a cup final very well as well. So I don't really want to talk about that because we're going to be talking positive about Man United today. But as a rival, you can't look at it and not be annoyed. Do you know what I mean? It's like to have a player of like Rodri is unbelievable. Don't get me wrong. But
of course.
You've now got almost like a backup talisman in that middle of the park, and that is nowhere taken away from the job that Mateo Kovacic done the other up, because he is someone who I actually would want to highlight from that game and say, if there was ever to say someone that has come in and seamlessly almost transitioned into understanding their role into Pep's system, I feel like he is one of the players that really sort of he just grew into the role game by game. And I feel like he's, with having those three in midfield now, like their midfield is a joke now.
Incredible.
And
he's like just a fantasy team,
KDB
isn't it?
now, and I think KDB is someone who every season it kind of seems like, oh, is he done? Is he going to be leaving? It doesn't look like he's going to be going on. I feel like he's someone who's coming to his latter years in the Premier League.
Yeah.
And I feel like as much as he's got so much love and appreciation now, I feel like we'll look back on KDB as one of the all-time greatest midfielders to ever grace the Premier League.
Oh, 100%. 100%. I almost feel like if this was the Serie A that we were talking about, you could probably see Kevin De Bruyne being transitioned into a regista, because that's the kind of ability that he's got. And it'll be fascinating to see what he decides to do going forward, whether he decides to stick it out in one of the top leagues after his contract ends at Man City, or whether he sees himself retiring. It'll be fascinating to see. But I think, yeah, you're right. I think he doesn't get maybe necessarily same kind of talk in terms of like him being on level with previous players that have maybe contributed less. But I think it's
David
just
Silva is an
that kind of
example that
feel.
shines for me.
Yeah, he's forgotten about, isn't he? Massively. But yeah, let's leave that kind of Chelsea and Man City talk and talk about your beloved Man United for once. And obviously, we will kind of talk about some of the questions that you had as well. But if I allude to first that kind of Fulham game, I think it was a breath of fresh air, right? It was kind of different. It seemed like there was an intensity. Although I knew about Mazraoui and his ability at Bayern, I thought he brought a different kind of composure at the back, which was nice to see. I think I'm not so keen on De Ligt, and we might allude to that, but I think one of the things that's pleasing for Man United was seeing Xerxes get off the mark as well. And one of the things that I've put as notes is, has he been learning from Rude? Because there's obviously been a little bit of that influence as well. But I know Xerxes has kind of got that element in his game, you know, what he did in terms of dropping off into that midfield, getting that touch before he eventually got that touch for the goal itself. That was typical of what we saw at Bologna in some respects, although at Bologna it was maybe a bit more aesthetical, so to speak. Not to like downplay this goal, but it was certainly a bit more aesthetical when we see it in Serie A. But I couldn't really kind of work out what to make of this Man United side, because at times they did seem like they were overrun in midfield, in particular Fulham on the counter-attack. If they could just get a striker, I think they were losing that kind of focal point. And it did feel to me like Fulham are just missing a Paulinho replacement now.
Do you know what I was
they've
thinking?
got Sanderberg. Gone.
If they had Mitrovic in that game, I don't think Man United would have won that game, man. But
I know.
I'm not going to complain. We walked away for 3 points. I can't complain about that. Sorry, continue. Go on, mate.
No, do you know what? All I was going to say was with Sanderberg being signed, I don't know if he's necessarily the Paulinho replacement, but we'll talk about Fulham in a minute. Let's talk about Man United. You seem quite happy by just the fact that you got a victory on the board, right?
If Casemiro, like, do you know what? Like, I thought he was so gone. I thought he was gone. I thought Ten Hag was gone. On Mazraoui, very quickly, because I don't want to spend too long talking about Man United. We've got other teams to talk about, and I just want to leave the podcast on a happy note. But Mazraoui looked like the perfect blend between Dalot and Wan-Bissaka. And I think that is, I think that has probably been the biggest headache for Ten Hag, is who's the better right back and who sort of would bring more to the team. And I think his versatility also comes into play. I was sad to see Wan-Bissaka go, but Mazraoui was amazing. Secondly, Casemiro must have dropped 15 kilos. Oh my God. I've never seen the bloke run so much. I haven't seen him run that much since his last like
Real Madrid days, right?
Exactly. It isn't all positive. Because I feel like the midfield did look very confused at times. Something that I will say is, with Casemiro looking a lot more agile and a lot better in his role, I feel like it installed a lot of confidence into the centre backs as well. The defense looked comfortable when playing the ball around. And I feel like one player I just always love to watch play is Amad Diallo. My reasoning for that is he is the perfect example of, if it doesn't work the first time, that doesn't mean keep your head down. You get up and you keep trying. And I feel like he is that type of player. That Garnacho, in a sense, that would always just keep trying to make things happen. And I feel like coming from starting last season with sulking Anthony on the right wing to now almost this young player coming back from a couple of really bad injuries to bounce back from a couple of loan moves to really get him back up to speed. And I feel like now we're really starting to see what Amad Diallo, because we didn't get to see that much of him at Atlanta, but I feel like we're now at a stage where he could really take the season by the scruff of the neck and go on and do some great things. But yeah, some positives. But Josh Xerxes, man, I love Josh Xerxes. I loved him at Bologna. And I was really excited when we signed him, because as much as he's a big physical presence, like someone like a Højlund, he brings something completely different. And you alluded to that, in which it's that dropping into the midfield and not being afraid to have the ball at his feet. And when you have players like Xerxes, and you then include that with someone like a Bruno Fernandes, who is not afraid to play those passes, not afraid to look for the ball in areas where most players are afraid to go, I feel like we're now really starting to see that this Man United team could be built to to be actually quite good. And I feel like I was screaming for Ten Hag's head at the end of last season, but I'm not necessarily saying that this is like the beginning of a new Manchester United. I'm not saying that at all, but you can kind of see that the foundations are now being laid in place, and there could be some positives to look back on at the end of this season, even though it's just started.
In terms of that balance that you say as well, what do you think it would be the ideal kind of person to come into that midfield? Because I think Mason Mount seems he's still lost. I don't know if he's got a role for him, so to speak. Like you say, Bruno Fernandes is kind of the pinnacle of that Man United side, but he won't suit for every scenario, right? So it does feel like maybe there's two players that they need to bring in. And there are rumours that Scott McTominay might be subject to a bid from Napoli in the coming few days. It looks like inevitably they've confirmed Billy Gilmour from Brighton to join Conte at Napoli. So that'd be fascinating to see how that works out. And it seems like Scottish midfielders seem to be in flavour right now. But from a Man United perspective, are you looking for someone that can control a midfield, or are you looking for someone that can do a box-to-box like role? I mean, what would be ideal in terms of the way that so far you've seen Man United play so far?
We've spoken off camera, and I feel like something in which has always come up about Manchester United is energy in the middle of the park. And I think it's something that we spoke about Conor Gallagher previously, and how much he's someone who brought so much by Chelsea just by being a pair of legs. And I know that sounds so silly to say about a footballer, but just being able to be that energy. And I think Manuel Guy, perfect example. We've been linked with him. It looks like we're going to sign him. Rumours are flying around about it. I think that is the type of midfielder. It's someone who's not injury prone. I don't think he missed a game last season through injury, which is great. Energy in the middle of the park. He wants to get the ball back. And I feel like we look at that balance in Manchester United midfield, and it's like, even when you would include someone like a Scott McTominay in there, who's always like, people don't really know Scott McTominay's best role in midfield. Is it a holding midfielder? Is it a 10? Like, what is Scott McTominay's best role? But when you have those players who are suited to what they bring to the team, in which you could have Bruno as that attacking midfielder, you could have Manuel Ugarte as that box-to-box, that energy in midfield, and you could have Casemiro almost like the Marshall, but I'm not going to pretend like Casemiro can't pass the ball, because he really can. And then you mix that with the defenders behind him, who now that's something in which Ten Hag is really started to lose, is that he wants his defenders to be able to pass the ball. And you're now starting to see this beautiful midfield of a lot of players who are more than comfortable passing the ball and doing so under pressure. And I think if you were to ask me at the beginning of the transfer window, I'd say two position I would sign up would be centre half and centre midfield. And I know you're not De Ligt's biggest fan, but I feel like he is someone who could come in and really thrive under Erik ten Hag. And Manuel Ugarte, he would be someone who would be perfect for me. But you add in the likes of Josh Xerxes in there. I think it's been a successful transfer window if we get this Manuel Ugarte deal over the line. So that's just the one for me. If we get that one, I feel like with that one, I feel like that could be the difference between the top 4 and top 6 finish this season.
Yeah. I mean, just quickly kind of allude to De Ligt. I feel like yourself, he will do a reasonable job. I don't think he's not going to not do a job. I think he'll be an upgrade on what Man United currently have. I suppose in my head, where I see Man United is you want to be competing with your bigger clubs, right? Your rivals, etc. I just think there's maybe more all-rounded like defenders that you could build your team around. And look, De Ligt, I kind of look at his career path and I just question, why is he not kind of broke it in Juventus? Why is he kind of then gone to Bayern Munich? And whilst I think largely a lot of the fan base were behind De Ligt, the fact that he got displaced by Eric Dyer, and I know that's not like anything to say Eric Dyer is a bad player. I think actually in the previous season, he actually showed that he can be a decent centre-back. I think he grew in terms of his actual all-rounded game. But I just think I look at Isaac Hien, for example, at Atalanta, and I think he's strong, powerful, pace. He's got all attributes that kind of combine to be a really good, strong defender alongside, say, Alessandro Martinez. You've got a formidable kind of defensive pairing there potentially. And I just wonder with De Ligt, will he get done on the turn? Will there be moments where I just think maybe a clever strike against him might get the better of him? We'll see. I'm happy to eat some humble pie on that one, and we'll see if I get egg on my face,
I'm
which
about to give you
inevitably
some
will
humble.
do.
I'm about to
Go
give
on,
you some
go for
humble
it.
pie right now, mate. So
Go
everyone has this idea of De Ligt displacing Eric Dyer, right? Out of all, over 90% of Eric Dyer's games that he played for Bayern Munich was alongside De Ligt. And not many people know this, and everyone's like, "Wait, what?" Doesn't sound like a true fact.
This is it.
Yeah, but I think the thing is with De Ligt, I feel like he's been unlucky almost with the clubs that he's ended up at, because he goes to a club and they seem to be in turmoil within like 18 months. And the same thing happened at Bayern. I feel like he was kind of the scapegoat for when things went wrong at Bayern. But I feel like Upamecano,
there's
like,
a wider issues.
Yeah, mate. Like Upamecano got some shocking performances that I saw. And I feel like with that type of player, he's going to get a lot of stick. But I feel like the one difference that he does bring is we brought in Lenny Yoro as well, and I think he's going to go be someone that will go on to do great things for Manchester United. It was obviously not great with his injury, but I feel like Man United have improved in the right area, and I feel like De Ligt can. You put De Ligt in with someone like a Maguire, who, as much as Maguire gets a lot of bad stick, he can be a great leader and sort of someone to kind of, he can marshal a defense very well. So I think sometimes you look at these players and I feel like De Ligt is an improvement on Maguire, but there's going to be times where to get up to speed in the Premier League, Maguire's going to be handing out a lot of advice to these younger players now coming through.
Quick word on Fulham. Obviously unlucky, I think, on the balance of the play of the game. You know, I felt they were unlucky not to have got a point. Points. I think they could have taken advantage a lot more on the counter attack. Where do you see them kind of sitting this season? Because I thought there'd be kind of maybe a team that might kind of break through a bit more, because I just felt like, look, with Marco Silva, he's established a kind of way of working with Fulham. I think if he just gets a few more additions through the door, then we could kind of see maybe a team that maybe kind of tries to get beyond that mid-table mix. But they've always kind of threatened, but they've never just had that caliber of player. Is it fair to say that they're just missing a few individuals in that team right now to push them on?
I'd put them in the same bracket pre-season as someone like a Crystal Palace, and I think they have got the foundations of what could be a great team for a few years. The only thing is going to be if they can keep hold of those players, which both of the clubs kind of failed to do. Both of them sold to Bayern Munich over the summer. And the second thing of that is, are they able to keep the core part of what it is to play like that team? Like Mateta is a prime example of an old school Premier League striker, and I think that's why he's really started to show what he's capable of at Crystal Palace. But I feel like with Fulham, I feel like they are that sort of team where I think Sander Berg will be a good signing for them. But you just look at them and you're like, if they just had that striker, like I think Munoz is great, but I'm not sold on them, man. I'm just not sold on them. I don't think he could be the difference into them pushing into those European spots. Like if you look at Brighton, and sort of one of the players that I've always looked at to them is someone like a João Pedro. I think he's the sort of, if you want to look and you're one of those clubs that really want to break into those European spots, someone like a João Pedro, I think, is the sort of striker you need in your team.
Right. Well, join us after this short break as we'll be discussing Spurs, Arsenal, and a bit of Leicester City as well. Welcome back. And Del, let's talk about Arsenal. Fantastic 2-0 win. They looked quite comfortable on the day, it has to be said. What I would say is that the Gunners seem quite controlled. They know what they're doing. It does feel inevitably that they will get a few more signings through the door. Obviously, they've got Calafiori, who started from the bench in this particular match. And it feels like if Moreno is going to be the next one through the door, because then Nketiah looks like he's going to be sold to Nottingham Forest. But one of the key kind of elements, I suppose, for Arsenal is I feel like they still need a striker within that kind of team itself to maybe help with the break locks in certain games as well. And I think, you've got someone in Gabriel Jesus who's a hardworking player. You've got Kai Havertz who's kind of having to kind of take that mantelpiece and become that striker. But I mean, when you look at that performance, you kind of think, well, there's a lot of confidence, there's a lot of optimism about Arsenal, but it does feel inevitably with the business that we've mentioned with Man City that they're still behind Man City inevitably. Is this going to be another season from Arsenal's point of view where they're just slightly behind Man City just because of the quality and the know-how of the Man City players?
I'm going to put this plain and simply: if Arsenal do not shine a top quality striker, I don't even think they're going to be in the same air as Manchester City this season. I feel like they'll drop even further off. You've seen, if you look at the Manchester City and Chelsea game, 9 out of 10 strikers don't finish that Haaland chance. I think that's the difference between a top club and a great club. And I think you look at these players who like to call themselves strikers in today's football, and I feel you look at an Erling Haaland, and he is the pinnacle of what you want your number 9 to be in the Premier League. Until Arsenal sign someone who can even be talked about in sentences close to Erling Haaland, I don't think they're going to be able to touch them. And I feel like it's the same for a lot of the Premier League. It pains me to say that as a Manchester United fan, but if they're on anything, I'm a realist. And I feel like Gabriel Jesus is someone who didn't leave on the best of terms with Pep. Everyone can say, oh, he left for game time, whatever. And it's like he left because he felt like he deserved more game time. And Pep spoke about him numerous times and sort of what he wanted that Gabriel Jesus couldn't provide. And that's sort of been proven right at Arsenal. And you look at someone like an Eddie Nketiah, who was always meant to be sort of that next number 9 for Arsenal, didn't really work out there. And I feel like we always sort of go through this period with Arsenal where they're all like, it was at that stage where they're nearly breaking the top 4 again. And it was like, right, they need a striker. Then they got Aubameyang and things were all right for a bit. And it's now they've seemed to have lost their firepower again. And it's great to see players like Bukayo Saka scoring for them, but they don't get a 9. I feel like they could be in trouble with, not in terms of if they can catch Manchester City, but more so they're going to be looking at the teams behind them, because a lot of the teams are going to be breathing down their necks this season, I think.
Yeah. And thinking about that, and let's stick with that kind of target man, whoever that would be. Now, obviously, they did try and get Benjamin Sesko in the summer, didn't kind of transition, unfortunately, because he decided to stay there. Now, the rumours are that it looks like that they've potentially agreed, in principle, a 50 million bid for Adamila Lookman from Atalanta. Now, obviously, I wouldn't say he's necessarily your out-and-out striker, but he's someone that can potentially be rotated, and a bit like your philosophy when you were alluding to, Rico Lewis being able to adapt to different positions. With Adamila Lookman, he's obviously played the line at the front end, but he can play on the wings as well. So he offers a bit of contribution in that area. But obviously you're alluding to, and I'm thinking broadly, this is where my assumption is, that you're thinking of like a Victor Osimhen style player, that you want someone that has got that kind of nous about him, the strength, the potential to break deadlocks and be, I suppose, that difference maker, like a Thierry Henry when he first joined Arsenal, for example. Do you think that Adamila Lookman is going to be someone that Arteta can maybe break and mould him, or do you think actually they should still be looking at like your Victor Osimhen's of the world really to
they need a
make
number
that
9
team complete? Yeah,
they need a number 9, mate. We've seen Arsenal do this 4, 5, 6, 7 times in our lifetimes, where Lucas Podolski was signed as a striker, ended up playing on the wing. Aubameyang ended up playing on the wing. Lacazette ended up playing on the wing at times. Do you know what I mean? Like, we've seen these when they have turned number 9s into wingers. I've never seen Arsenal as a club turn a winger into a striker. I feel like we're now looking at this Arsenal team. I don't necessarily think that 9 is going to make them one of the best teams in the world, because I feel like they are already at that level of one of the best teams in world football. But if they want to be one of the greatest teams in world football, they need a number 9. If I'm them and it gets to the end of the transfer window, just go for Ivan Toney. Just go, like, that is what I would do. I would go for an Ivan Toney. They need, like, we were speaking about how players in these dynamic roles in which they play. The one role that isn't dynamic in Pep Guardiola's team is the striker. And that is how he plays his system now. And I feel like if you want to be a successful Premier League team in today's game, I feel like you need to have that presence up top, and that's something which Arsenal lack in any way or form.
So you're kind of putting your hat on the ring and saying potentially Ivan Toney, but if people look at his temperament and what he, I suppose, the bad kind of attributes, do you think Arteta can control that kind of personnel? Because he's proved it with Aubameyang that he doesn't like people that disrupt the kind of the temperament, the kind of like the temperature, but also I suppose the dressing room more importantly. He doesn't want people that disrupt the system. So thinking broadly, do you think there are other potential candidates that Arsenal could go out for? Because I'm just thinking out loud, like, could there be a potential for someone like Gonçalo Ramos, who's at PSG, who's not really getting that game time? Maybe someone of that caliber that could come in and maybe make that difference. But I can't think broadly outside of maybe Victor Osimhen, personally.
It's another Victor, mate. Gyökeres, mate. I feel like that is going to be the one that comes back to bite Arsenal, because they were in for him, and I don't know if that was confirmed, but there was rumours of them being in talks with Coventry at the time, and they didn't end up signing him. He ended up going to Sporting Lisbon, and I feel like he's sort of the one where if I was to look at sort of a player that would suit Arsenal's style of play perfectly, because they want a number 9, but they also want someone who can link up that play, because that is the type of system that Arsenal play, and it is that very quick passing football. And if you're gonna, he is a player who started, I think it's 3 goals and 3 assists already this season for Victor Gyökeres, and he's just proving why. Everyone said, oh, how is a guy going from the Championship to the Portuguese champions? That is how he does it. And he's done so in Europe. And now I feel like those are the types of players you need. I feel like one of the biggest things that's lost in strikers is a lot of that grit. And I feel like that is one of Haaland's best traits. And that's what separates a lot of these top strikers. And I feel like Victor Gyökeres has that in heaps. And I feel like if I was to Arsenal and there was a blank checkbook in front of me, I wouldn't even go for Osimhen. I would go for Gyökeres.
Just thinking also,
a substantial amount of money.
and I don't know if Arsenal would do this, but with Federico Chiesa's kind of situation at Juventus, could that be a gamble that Arteta decides to take, given there is a player under him? There could be someone that can be molded into the Arteta style, but he can also be the difference maker in terms of getting you really critical goals. Do you see him maybe potentially being like a gamble bid towards the end of the window?
I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up at Arsenal before the end of the transfer window. But if you were to ask me at the beginning of the summer where I think he'd end up, I would have said Chelsea. I would have said Chelsea high. Like before the beginning of the transfer, he suits Chelsea's system perfectly. They kind of need a bit more of experience on a wing, someone who could come in. He would have been perfect. But I feel like that Chelsea don't need to sign anyone else, so they need to relax and just close the checkbook and stop bringing players through the door. But yeah, I feel like there's a few players out there I feel like could really make a substantial difference to a lot of the, other than your Manchester City, but I think Arsenal, Manchester United are in that sort of, Tottenham are in that space. I feel like Liverpool, Arne Slot doesn't get, he hasn't started off getting a lot of great publicity, but I feel like they could be there. I feel like even the teams that are just outside the European places, and I feel like these next few days and the final days of the transfer window are going to be detrimental to really how these teams kick on, because we know what it's like. If you don't sign well now, you've then got no chance to do so until January, which then, essentially the season's pretty much done by then.
Yeah, exactly. Or you're really gambling on it, maybe working for yourself as well at the same time. Quick word on Wolves then. They were kind of everyone's kind of favourites for what they achieved last season, you know, the underdog, so to speak, and Gary O'Neill got them playing good football. I wouldn't say aesthetically always pleasing on the eye, but it got them playing, and I suppose credit for where it's due, you know, in the circumstances. You know, he got this team galvanized. This time around, obviously, the talisman in Neto has been sold off. It feels like they're still a few bodies short, for example. Where do you see kind of Wolves sitting this season? Because, on that performance against Arsenal, it looks like they're kind of nervous. They seem to lack a bit of what they had last season, which was grit. And, they had that kind of determination about them. It didn't matter what they were under, they would still go out and prove doubters wrong. Whereas this kind of start, and I appreciate it's only one game week, right? So you probably want these kind of errors and issues to occur at this stage in the season. But do you feel like they're a club that could be dragged into the relegation fight if they're not careful?
I feel like Wolves could be in a relegation fight, but it was too close. And I think the Pedro Neto news coming so close to the first game of the season, and it's just like it must have been like a sort of, imagine you've done 90% of your preseason. It's just like, right, our best player is now going off to a team where I don't even know if Pedro Neto is going to play every single game for Chelsea. Do you know what I mean? And it's just like, I think that more than anything is probably going to be more of a slap in the face to Wolves. It's just like, you have signed the one guy who can do anything for us that they probably felt and really saved them up points last season. And they've now taken him, and he starts on that. Probably, I would say, seeing him start on the bench is probably even more of a slap in the face as well. So it's just like, you're looking at sort of what the options are at hand here for Wolves, and I feel like they're going to be, if we're talking about teams that need to dip into the transfer market, they're going to be a team that needs to do so to save themselves from relegation.
I do joke about the fact that they'll probably end up with 10 Portuguese players that we've never heard of, and they'll be like blossoming into diamonds as they always do at Molineux. But we'll wait and see how that kind of pans out for them. Let's move on to Arsenal's kind of North London rivals, and that was Spurs. A lot of optimism, a lot of hype about what they did in this summer transfer window. But, it seemed like it was much more of the same on Monday night, where they drew against Leicester City, when you've got a 37-year-old Jamie Vardy being more savvy than Christian Romero in the centre of defence. You've got to start questioning. You've just got the question, I suppose, have Spurs learned from last season? And I know Ange alluded to a lot of the fact that he's still trying to embed this philosophy and style of football. But I think Spurs fans are starting to get a bit frustrated that they haven't really rectified the issues from last season, which was the defending, the kind of control of games, seeing out games, because in particular that first half, they should have been 4 goals ahead. They just didn't seem to have that little bit of edge to them as well. So where do you think Ange approaches this, and do you think Spurs can still push on despite this kind of setback on Monday night?
I think Dominic Solanke has to start. You're paying 65 million.
Yeah.
Come on. How many goals did he get in the league last season?
19.
Why is he not starting? Yeah. You're paying that many. You're paying that much. I don't care. I'm going to say, he hasn't really gelled in with the team yet. He ain't really pals with everyone. I don't want to hear none of that, mate. You paid that much money and you're paying him to score goals. You get him on the pitch and you say, score me some damn goals. And I feel like that's something in which Solanke's been signed to do. And I feel like Son's obviously at the latter stages of his career now, especially at Tottenham. So I feel like he is someone who kind of needs that weight taken off of his shoulders almost. I would love to see him and Solanke play together. Just because he's almost like that Harry Kane, that sort of that poacher type of striker, that guy that will really try and make something happen in games.
Yeah.
Richardson, he hasn't really got that about him to sort of make that happen. So to see Son with that sort of strike partner again could be quite exciting. So I feel like that could go on to do great for Spurs, but I don't think they've learned from last season at all in the mistakes. It's just like the mistakes were there at both ends of the field, and it's just like, I get it. He's trying to install this philosophy. It's great, but at what point do we say, is it really working out? And that's not me saying Ange should go.
No.
That's more to say I think some of the players that he's signed for his system haven't worked out in the way that he would have hoped.
And I wonder if also, like you allude to, is that balance. Like I see Son and maybe Maddison very similar, although they've got different attributes to their game, but similar in the way that they try and impact the game, right? So is it an aspect of that there's 2 players that maybe are very similar, but because they're trying to do similar types of things for Spurs, that actually then that leaves that kind of triple effects, I suppose, in the sense of then they're left lacking in other areas. I think when you look at kind of in the middle where they're kind of looking at the likes of Pape Sarr, for example, and Bentancur being your holding players and players that potentially do a little bit of that donkey work and maybe help out those defenders. I didn't necessarily see that on Monday night. I saw quite a placid midfield, and whilst there was some attributes that were quite exciting about Spurs' approach, actually there was elements where it just felt like it was much of the same again from the previous season, where actually the players aren't getting the philosophy. You can see visibly that Ange is getting frustrated as well. Like, it's clearly that he's been telling and drilling them so many times in training to do a certain style of football, but they're not necessarily gaining it or understanding what they're supposed to do. So I'm going to pose this. Do you think that they're probably let down in the sense that they need more quality midfielders or quality style of players? Because I think when you look at the style of players they bought up and coming players, like Archie Gray, great potential, right? But he's going to take some time to mold into the player that we think that he will kind of flourish into. Bergvall as well, like, he looks phenomenal. He's got elements to him that looks like he's quite mature. But there was an element where he almost let the ball go to Leicester City and they almost scored from the counter-attack from his mistake. So is it that they just need a few more experienced heads that would maybe help them out in terms of what they're trying to achieve in the long run?
I don't even know if it's experienced heads. I feel like the word that I used to describe Tottenham the other night was lethargic in midfield. And I feel like that's something in which most people wouldn't have been able to describe them with if they tried last season. The one thing that always sort of worked for them was the legs and the energy in midfield and really trying to make something happen. And at times, I feel like they actually played better when Maddison wasn't playing in the central midfield role last season. And I feel like that's something which really sort of will start to come into play, because it's like you've now got all of these players who want to make something happen, have got the ability to make something, but it's now what system is Ange going to play that's going to get the best out of all of his players? Because I feel like if we look back on what system he played, there were some bright sparks in it, but it didn't necessarily complement everyone's attributes.
Yeah. And that's probably the element that you've touched on, something really good there, actually. When you think about the centre-backs that they've got at their club, the likes of Dragusin, who's come off a fantastic Euros, and I think at the tail end of Spurs' season, he was probably one of their better players as well. So for me, it just kind of spells out that maybe they should play with a 3 centre-back pairing, because 2 isn't good enough. And we saw by the fact that Jamie Vardy took advantage of Romero just not concentrating. It needs someone to be that extra man to kind of deal with those situations. And I'm actually surprised that maybe when I think about broadly tactics, like Ange hasn't kind of looked at the philosophy of a 3-4-3 that he can then push into like a 5 at the back if needs be, with the wing backs with Pedro, for example, and Udogie on that left-hand side. So it'd be fascinating to see how he kind of maybe works out what his best team is, because I think he's almost very heavy in midfield. Would I be right in thinking that? I mean, that's going to be
too heavy in midfield.
Word for Leicester then. Obviously, they recovered from that first half, but Jamie Vardy steps up to the plate, gets an important goal, and does his typical shithousery to Spurs fans' face anyway. Where do you see Leicester? Because I feel like with Leicester, they've got an established man like Steve Cooper who will play the pragmatic style, but also in time, I'm sure he'll get them to a place where they're actually maybe playing good aesthetic football. However, preseason wasn't brilliant for them. And it feels like with the inevitable issues with PSR at the moment, that's hampering their chances of signing players. Do you think that's going to play a part in terms of how they are going to be in the league?
One thing I think Steve Cooper might actually go down as one of the appointments of the season. I feel like he's one of those managers that never really sort of he's always sort of had the asterisk next to his name, which I think is actually quite sad. I think he'll do a really good job at Leicester. I feel like they have got the foundations of a Premier League club already in there, because it was a yo-yo. So we're now in a position where they've got a lot of really great talent in their team, but I think the biggest problem Leicester are going to face is they are bouncing back into the Premier League in the middle of a transitional period. Yes, it was great from Jamie Vardy, but he is 37 years old, and it's like now they've really got to find that balance between playing Jamie Vardy in the games where they need to get the points and they know that they've almost got that chance, but also with bringing through these younger players who, as they fight off the battle of relegation this season, which will probably be inevitable if I'm being completely honest, it's about bringing those experienced heads into the team, but also giving those younger players the time to thrive at the time in which they can. And I feel like that's something in which Leicester did really well last season, and they had a lot of good young players sort of in their team, and a lot of newer players emerging, like Stephen Mafdidi, which is someone who I've really enjoyed watching in France, and now to see him potentially get that Premier League sort of status under him, I think is great as well. But I think Leicester are going to struggle because
massively
financially, if you can't play against when you're seeing Rutner get signed for the second time in his career for over 40 million is absolutely wild to me. So to be the other teams around them are still dipping into the market, and I feel like it could come back. I feel like if they don't get this right, I feel like they could end up going back down again.
Yeah, hopefully. Look, even with the kind of signing of Steve Cooper, maybe the view is even if we do go down, we'll put trust behind him. You know, he will get us back up, and I think he will do a phenomenal job in the Championship anyway because he knows that league quite well as well. So, fingers crossed. Let's see if they can get a few more signings through the door. But I'm going to quickly squeeze in Ipswich and Liverpool purely because I did love the way that Ipswich approached Liverpool and didn't really give Liverpool time to kind of relax, in particular in that first half. And Arne Slot kind of alluded to it, which I think was quite refreshing to see how open he was in terms of explaining that they didn't win their battles. They didn't know what to do in that first half. And that's why they were almost conceding goals in that first half. But two questions that I've got is, where do you see Liverpool sitting? Because it feels like we alluded to it at the very beginning that it feels like they just haven't got the transfer business done. And inevitably, unfortunately, there's been a lot of moving cogs. You know, you've got the new kind of director of football in Richard Hughes there, who's obviously trying his very best by the sounds of it. But because of the kind of transitional kind of phase from the Klopp era, that there's a lot to consider when it comes to Liverpool. So maybe stability and being in that top four is not like best kind of case for Liverpool this season. But ultimately, you can see that Arne Slot is not going to contend with just being in the top four. I think he wants to be pushing this team. So do you think they're just missing a number 6 in that midfield to kind of replace what has been a bit of a gap under Klopp last season and potentially what Henderson kind of left in his kind of reign at Liverpool?
I feel like Gravenberch was probably a player that they signed thinking that he could almost play that number 6 role. But I feel like the number 6 role in the Premier League, I think, is different to when you're playing in your La Ligas and your Bundesligas and your Series. I feel like it's a much more physical, but also it takes a lot more football IQ than it would in most of the other leagues. You have to be aware of the danger at all times because the counter in the Premier League is much faster than it will be in most leagues. So it's almost like the suicide run. I call it the suicide run midfielder anyway, in which they're just running. And that's a role in which most teams really struggle to kind of get. And I said how great it was to see Casemiro 15 kilos lighter playing that role for Manchester United the other day. But I feel if they get a 6, they could be dangerous because he seems like he's got a good philosophy there. But I'll also say this. If Liverpool don't do well this season, I feel like the clear out next summer could knock them back for about 3 or 4 years, if not longer.
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly a job that needs to happen, but I think a lot of it will be decisive in terms of what they do in January, in terms of keeping certain personnel. I think there's rumours about Van Dijk potentially not signing his contracts. The likes of Mo Salah has probably potentially instigated that he might not sign his contracts. So there's 2 key players there already. And it looks inevitably like Mamadashvili, the Valencia goalkeeper who did phenomenal for Georgia, looks like they're trying to bring him in. And inevitably that seems to indicate that maybe Alisson's on his way out as well. So Going to be a big next 2 seasons. That's all I can think for this Liverpool side. And that's probably music to your ears, given that you're a Man United fan. But at that point, what I'm going to do is quickly allude to game week 2, because we've got that kicking off from Saturday. So we actually start, Del, with your very own Man United away to Brighton at 12:30 on Saturday. So fun time kickoff, as Jurgen Klopp would allude to. But at 3 p.m, we've got Crystal Palace versus West Ham, Fulham taking on Leicester, Man City at home to Ipswich, Southampton at home to Nottingham Forest, Spurs at home to Everton, and then at 5:30 on Saturday, we will see Aston Villa taking on Arsenal. Then we'll move into Saturday's fixtures. At 2 o'clock, we've got Bournemouth taking on Newcastle, Wolves taking on Chelsea, and then at 4:30, we've got Liverpool at home to Brentford. So that is your game week 2. Before I kind of send you off, Del, many thanks for joining us and to discuss all the many topics, including your very own Man United in a positive light for once. Where can people check out your work, more importantly, and find you?
Del Tafik on all my socials. I just want to say, if I'm looking forward to any game that's not Manchester United this weekend, that West Ham and Palace game looks like it is going to be a great game. 2 clubs who've done really well in the transfer window after losing big players over previous seasons. So yeah, I'm excited. If I'm excited for a good London derby this weekend, and I'm off this Saturday, so that's something to celebrate, mate.
Fingers crossed you'll see goals, but knowing the curse of this podcast, it'll be 0-0, because that's what always happens, right, when we talk up matches like this. But more importantly, for you, listener and viewers, thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And also, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our social media channels. So we're at Anglo-Italian Pod on the likes of Instagram and TikTok. And if you want to find us on Twitter, or X as they call it these days, it's at Italian Anglo Pod. And also, if you haven't checked out, we've also got a Serie A podcast. Make sure you check that out ahead of this weekend as well, where I was talking with Andrea. So make sure you check that out. But many thanks to you, Del. Have a great weekend, whatever you're up to, guys. And we'll see you next weekend. Ciao, ciao.